All right. I'm excited to present our second panelist, Laure Michelon. I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong. Do correct me when you get up here. Laura is a founding partner of MMR, a lecturer at UCLA Architecture and Urban Design, and a creative and architectural technologist based in Los Angeles. Her research and practice focus on digital simulation and algorithmic mutations with specific interests in infrastructural systems, climate engineering, machine vision, and fashion. Laura has taught at SciArc, Kent CAED, and AAVS Seoul. And she has worked as an architectural designer at Studio Kinch and at Euler Wu Collaborative, and as an energy analyst, CSR lead, and a building facade analyst at Glomac Tetra Tech. I'm having trouble with these things. Her personal work has been exhibited in galleries throughout Los Angeles, including Von Zimmer Gallery and the Tetrapod Gallery, and she has curated multiple shows in collaboration with Super Collider. Laura holds a postgraduate Master's of Science in Architectural Technologies from SciArc, where she graduated with distinction, and a Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering from Columbia University. Laura's talk is titled Mediation Layer. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks. Yeah, hi. My name is Laure. I'm coming from Los Angeles, where I teach in the postgraduate program. It's a Master's of Science in Architectural Technology. I'm happy to be here. I'm super excited about all the presentations so far, so I think this is going to be fun. Hopefully, we'll see. So before I start, I always love to give myself a tiny bit of context, because I think, as was said, like, I have my undergraduate degree in civil engineering. I did a lot of research and work there on using recycled waste material as aggregate in concrete. Most specifically, we were kind of focusing on e-waste and recycled computer parts, but also styrofoam and glass. I've worked as an electrical designer on Disney Shanghai and the Wilshire Grand in LA. I've also worked as an energy analyst, energy modeler, and sustainability strategist who worked on everything from campus scale energy audits to high performance facade design to microclimate analysis. And I have my master's in architectural technologies, where my final, not thesis project, but like final project, was focused on air quality in Mexico City and using direct air capture right next to high density housing. So my expertise is not in computer science, nor is it in architecture or engineering, really. Not in urban design, nor is it in art. It's kind of in a weird hybrid world that, if you can't tell already, I'm having a hard time classifying and still trying to figure out where I fit within all of this. But most of my work falls within two different categories and scales, depending on the project, either large-scale climate engineering or fashion. So today my talk is titled The Mediation Layer, which to me, the mediation layer is the interpreter and converter between data collected from different sources and most likely in different formats, and those who end up consuming it. So it's like the way of making sense of complex ideas and insane amounts of information. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to try to think about it over 3 chapters, from representation to interaction to systems mapping. So first, in terms of research and then representation. So kind of like the basic interpretation of this mediation layer is like researching something and then applying visuals that might either enhance it or essentially act as data viz. Essentially, generative AI models, in a way, especially these diffusion models that are steered by CLIP, are really just essentially data visualization. Complex language as the input gets synthesized and the output imagery is the representation of that. This is essentially the premise of my piece, Translation, which was shown at Biosphere 2 last year. Climate change is essentially a pattern or series of patterns drawn from planetary scale data collection that is synthesized and interpreted through a climate model. By the time the information makes its way to the public, it's already been translated through numerous phases and filters: sensing, dataset collection, climate modeling, the IPCC condensation and filtration, and the media translations. As our culture becomes more dependent on the visualization of information, it kind of necessitates a reinterpretation of this information. So this project emphasizes both the success and shortcomings of the language that was used to write the original documents. The act of translation suggests an alteration, a change in a given language's form, condition, or nature, often with the intention to explain the original subject matter in a term that it could be made more easily understood. So by translating the IPCC climate report into visuals generated by a variety of neural networks, translation aimed to adjust the way in which we could be informed by the data inside the report. So these trained machine learning models reinforce and reconstitute known imagery through the bias inherent in the curated dataset, producing visuals that broaden the report's ability to be understood and serve to a broader call to action. As an aside, this project being shown at Biosphere Chair, it was projected on the North Lung, which if you don't know about that building, it's my absolute favorite, and the entire history of it is so fascinating in both of its failed experiments. I would highly recommend going and taking a tour of it. I also made friends with the mechanical engineer who took me on his night rounds through the building, and I got to experience everything through the lens of the person who's there to make it continue to operate, which was a dream come true. I hope to go back and visit him. But so this project is less like data visualization and more like adding a layer of legibility to existing data. Also, just in general, I think that some layer of machine learning overlay or manipulation remains constant within all of my projects. But in the office, we're working on a temporal coherence kind of strategy using a variety of workflows for using let's say, dirty input video. Here, this is screenshots. It's actually video, but screenshots of Google Earth of downtown LA. And then adding layers of diffusion models and some other tools for constraint. So adding information, cleaning information, adding legibility, or a kind of layer of paint or filter on top of it. These Laure models that we're working with aren't meant to completely transform everything, but instead to act as a kind of render pass on top of it. And then really kind of leveraging segmentation models and control net to constrain it back to make sure it stays within a reasonable bounds of what we're aiming for. The focus on research is probably more obvious in two seminars, well, a couple of seminars that I've taught at UCLA. This project, Planet B, Speculations on Exoplanetary Life, started with researching or kind of using existing research from NASA that they've put on this platform called Eyes on Exoplanets, which is taking kind of their basic information that might include the chemical composition, mass, temperature, what have you, and represent it in Unreal Engine and Houdini, which for incoming students to UCLA that have a more traditional architectural background was very fun for me to watch them go through. Seems mean, but it's not. And then in this project, students were tasked with designing a VR experience or game from the eyes of a non-human other. This group obviously chose one of their dogs, Cora. So the color scheme here references the colors that dogs perceive, and the communication methods of movement and gamification are tailored towards the dog and not the human. I think this is most specific in the P-mails that dogs leave each other, apparently, as a way of communicating. This project was really fun, but they were actually interested in continuing this into being less of a game, but more of a visualization of how a dog might experience this as a way of better understanding. Not machine vision, but the project was an exploration in the vision of the other. So funny. I think the intention of this at the end is he had to find his toy to be able to get back home. But so the next step beyond just representation is obviously interaction. And coming face to face with the data set or with the complexity of a system, and then being able to interact with that data, you obviously gain another level of insight in how the system is either working or not working. And this might be in interaction and gamification of infrastructure systems or in a data set that is rife with bias. But I also think back to my previous life as an energy modeler in the energy model of the building that is simulating the energy, water, waste systems of that building. So in this class, it was using game engines as a training tool or a gamification tool for a complicated infrastructure system. So designing or reimagining the architectural home in which we live in close proximity to decentralized infrastructure systems that might include algae, carbon capture, or wastewater treatment. And then through this course, students learned how to design and integrate these systems into the architecture of the home, design the UI/UX maintenance infrastructure needed to operate the system in VR, and then representing it both in VR but also in pitch decks in terms of how to get funding. So here, the VR experience of maintaining a direct air capture plant that is within an apartment complex is split into two users, the tenant and the engineer. The tenant view sees whether an engineer is remoted into the space or not, or maybe if something is working or not, whereas the engineer has the range of inputs and errors that they can access. The ways of, like, this way of interacting with data isn't even, like, novel or new or exciting. The Air Force, HVAC companies, Rolls-Royce Aviation are all implementing technologies and workflows like this, a lot of which is for safety and also just for cost savings. So here's an example where the interaction with the data set is less gamified and more kind of just reflected back at you. Machinic Reflections was a piece that I did last year. And I started thinking about this piece as a way to try and figure out how to explain myself and my categories of, am I an architect, an engineer, a technologist, an artist, a researcher, an educator, and then forcing others to undergo the same sort of snap judgment made by the other. I ultimately expanded this to 16 different categories of jobs and then 400 associated faces that I scraped from LinkedIn, except for, besides jobs, obviously conspiracy theorist is not a job that is on LinkedIn, but I wanted to add it, so I did. I also want to kind of mention the fact that 400 is not that many faces. I mean, it was a lot to do per category, don't get me wrong, but in terms of building out a robust model, that's really not enough. But that's not the point. The point is to kind of think about the bias inherent in the data set and even to highlight that. So in this sense, having a poorly trained model made a lot of sense. But machine vision, image classifiers, object detection, and facial recognition are used in governments, police departments, security companies, the military, tech companies. We allow our faces to be recognized for our phones, both for security reasons and TikTok filters. During COVID, classification models were used to recognize if you were wearing masks or not. These algorithms exist and are being implemented in a variety of classification models. And according to these algorithms, what do you look like? And what do you want to look like? Do you embody any of these classifications reflected back at you? It's both a version of reality and a simulacrum. The classification reflects an unknown representation from the data and the model of us back. As an aside, those are my parents on the right-hand side. My dad was very proud to get architect, which I thought was very fun. He's not an architect, but beside the point. But yeah, I think the most interesting part of this project was actually people's reaction to it. So treating it really as like a fortune teller, or they were so angry with me when their reading was not what they wanted, I guess. To which my point is always, there is no correlation between your face and your job. You should be wary of how this data is being used because it is being used today. The point is to highlight that bias. I also had made these masks that were different generated versions of my own face that you could hide behind if you felt uncomfortable. So this project turned into, or kind of extended into a course that I taught last spring at UCLA called Proxy Faces, Masks, Manipulation, and Machine Vision, that investigated both the classification and generative machine learning models, as well as a variety of mask making techniques that might help us to embrace, distort, or hide from our classification, where the masks or proxy faces served as a type of prosthetic through which the user could disrupt their classification. And students could have an aim of looking more human, less human, to look like something else, to look like nothing at all. We actually only had one student that tried to increase the percentage of human. And she did this by adding multiple eyes, noses, and mouths all over, which it's funny because we didn't, because of how we were testing this under different lighting conditions in different ways, which is why most of these look like person instead of how we were actually testing them in class. But at the final is when we finally got like the actual numbers for her back, and she could increase her percentage human by about 3 percentage points, which was really fun. Again, here you can't really tell, but if she had done this under the correct lighting conditions that I said, it would have been fine. But these, oh, I guess actually I want to skip to the end of it because, oh shit. Come on. Let me do it. Oh well, I'll just say it. But at the end of it, I also made students wear them out in public and take photos of people's reactions to them, which was so much fun to collect homework in terms of that. But also I think for the students, it was really interesting to see where they decided to take them and under what context they decided their mask made most sense. So, yeah. But part of me also, like, these are all very interesting kind of interventions or ways of thinking about, I guess, my version of architecture. But ultimately, I kind of come back to like what's really important here, like what's really important to me. And a lot of this is coming back to systems mapping. And so when talking about mapping systems, I think it's more of focusing the data analysis, not on the individual, but on the mass. So a lot of this work stems from my anxieties for our future. The climate anxieties associated with carbon and methane emissions, about critical mineral mining, about energy generation, and about waste. Over the past few centuries, humans have very chaotically and often accidentally transformed Earth's ecosystems, and in response, the emergent intelligence represented by large-scale systems mapping and computation makes it important to conceive an intentional, directed, and worthwhile planetary scale design, which is often referred to as a terraforming. This comes not from the computing infrastructure itself, but in the design intention with which we focus it. So systems mapping applied to the city scale opens the door for a field of inquiry and practice that sees urbanized areas as a depository of various types of intelligences. Algorithmic governance and data-driven planning, in their attempt to deliver new urban efficiencies and decrease the messiness of lived realities, often foregoes the intelligence of local communities and knowledge institutions. So thinking about alternate concepts of computational models of urbanism, possible ways of embedding digital technology into existing environments, trying to navigate a complex web of urban policies and development, and understand how large systems work, engage with local communities, local issues, and design new social and technical infrastructures that prioritize spatial and digital justice, which is kind of funny to go into the next, well, this project, which was essentially asking students to project into the future with a what-if statement. So what if the city of Seoul's landfills were 100% filled? What next? Dealing with an issue of lack of space for landfills, thinking about the problem on a temporal scale that allows us to transform them, not a quick fix. It's zooming out and thinking about it more holistically, and then diagramming these systems, which I think is a super important part of the step, taken really from like cybernetics as a way to bridge between the past and obsessive interest in prediction, the future, and the virtual. Computational searches as a foundation for observing, documenting, and analyzing the world using feedback loops and management of urban space. Because like, how do maps shape our understanding of the world, and how does this world get coded into the maps and diagrams of any of our data dashboards even? The historical continuity of our cartographic culture parallels the rapid change in mapping technologies and forms of visualization. So using archival and technical research, machine vision, intelligent agents to analyze, represent, and manipulate infrastructure at the urban scale. Here, students created a historically situated, technologically literate, and data-driven representation of 6 different areas in Los Angeles. All the areas were designated for freeway construction that never took place for a variety of reasons. And then instead of kind of discussing the geographic and economic fragmentation caused by these freeways, students who, in this case, I feel like it's important to note these students were ages 13 to 17, but created multiple representations of the socio-technical urban fabric. Then representing this in a stack of like a digital collage with layers of satellite imagery, GIS data, segmentation models, archival images, really anything that was important for the developed topic and argument. One of the first ones, not this one, well, I'll talk about it when I get there. One of the students was obsessed with the idea of mapping the Christmas spirit in Los Angeles and dead set on doing the Christmas spirit. And there was no changing. There were no other holidays. It was the Christmas spirit in Los Angeles. And it was like, okay, let's do it. It's this one. And I was like, gathering information for her was also not using a traditional search engine, but TikTok. And then I was like, fine, let's screenshot it. And that's going to be how we're going to represent this at different data points. And then, I mean, for me, this is fun because it wasn't ever a topic that I would have necessarily chosen for a class, for a workshop, for what have you. But letting them kind of run with it in their own way was so much fun. So I guess getting back to my anxieties, the temperatures are increasing, carbon emissions are untethered, sea levels rise, the reservoirs are depleted. Wildfires are constantly consuming the Northwest and Los Angeles. Hurricanes flood New York, as well as the rest of the East Coast. How do we interact with and confront these realities as designers? With ecological, social, and formal systems pushed to their limits. How do we use technology and design as operative tools to envision a future landscape? So again, based off of, after reading through the IPCC climate report on advancing carbon capture and sequestration, and then a few months after that, the US released their methane reduction plan. I guess for me, I spend a lot of time thinking about carbon emissions as the main culprit to focus on for anthropogenic climate change, but what I had not realized is that methane actually accounts for 30%. And as the IPCC had explained in that report, 1 ton of methane in the atmosphere has about 80 times the warming impact of a ton of CO2. And this was a total game changer for me because I guess I didn't know. And so this project, which is part research, part art project, aimed to connect the systems of large-scale seaweed farming of brown kelp for carbon sequestration and red seaweed for the addition to cow feed in order to reduce methane emissions. So these are going to be some fun statistics, but each cow burps about 220 pounds of methane annually. I bet you did not realize that it was from cow burps because I think everyone thinks it's cow farts. It's not, it's cow burps. In fact, one company actually designed this helmet to put over a cow that would capture their burps, and it's just like, what? That was wild. And then, okay, so 220 pounds of methane annually, and California has about 1.72 million dairy cows and 670,000 cattle. These numbers are from 2 years ago, but staggering. The site is just north of Los Angeles, off the coast of Ventura, and extends inland towards Bakersfield. So I used mostly CycleGAN for this project to transform and manipulate satellite imagery of the area into a proposal for locations of seaweed farming, as well as areas that would be used as the nursery pools and seaweed sport incubation for the red seaweed. Then ran it through a variety of other models to help extract information about what type of seaweed could be grown in what location. The new system is in 2 parts. Again, diagrammed as always, but the brown kelp for carbon sequestration is grown on a series of kelp elevators, of which they're testing off the coast of Catalina now. In deep water, they grow about 24 inches per day. Once matured, they are then harvested by autonomous drones and then sunk to a depth over 1,000 meters, which then means that it's sequestered. Anything less than that is it rises to the top and then just reintroduces into the carbon cycle. But the second part of the system was growing red seaweed in the shallower areas. It grows about 10 inches per day and is harvested every 6 to 8 weeks. It's then dried, processed, refined in order to maximize the amount of bromoform content. So cows eat about 50 pounds of dry food per day. And then by replacing 1% of this, that's 0.5 pounds of dried seaweed, the change in diet, like strictly from adding bromoform, reduces the cow methane emissions by 87%. And of course, like with either current or proposed system, the cows could be used as like biogas to fuel any other aspect of moving part of the system. So all of this research is based off of research being done at UC Davis right now. One part of how they're testing this as well is that they are still testing the milk and meat for taste afterwards to make sure the bromoform doesn't affect it, which is fascinating. But so this project then, it kind of merged with another project, phytogeography, which was shown here at the Tetrapod Gallery last year. But phytogeography is the study of the geographic distribution of plant species and their influence on the Earth. It implies a new planet-scale shift in the understanding of how and where we exist. From this aggregation of data, phytogeography aims to create an aesthetic interface, making the borders of planetary biology readable. 24 minutes, I'm going so slow. I was really trying to speak slowly because when I'm excited, I talk way too fast and it's a whole situation. So this is a student project. Okay, so like the system design and terraforming isn't just biological. Sometimes it is synthetic, it's artificial. But that doesn't mean it's fake, just that it's designed. So in order to kind of reclaim this human machine intelligence and urban scale automation become a part of this expanded landscape of life, information, and labor, they are part of the living environment and not a substitute for one. So this project is a part of a Maximum City Studio at UCLA, was looking at a city scale way to remove excess carbon from the atmosphere at scale. And located in Russia due to the different basalt formations that are currently there, moving the landscape in order to better think about wind flow at scale, and then representing it in a little bit too sci-fi of a way, but fine. Or maybe as a project that's like a little bit more human-centered. A studio I co-taught with Casey Ream at Kent State that was looking at how technology in the realms of sensing, simulation, and automation could generate new architectural models for how we inhabit future landscapes. In this project, Diane and Sarah proposed a way to kind of capture excess carbon in the atmosphere and wastewater from the surrounding Cuyahoga River, simultaneously purifying and cleaning Cleveland's polluted air and water through microalgae production. This farming infrastructure system takes the existing toxic site and carves into the land to create our new transformed landscape, where waterways bring the Cuyahoga River water into the site to provide for the algae production. This kind of systems thinking and urban scale affords us as designers the ability to like leverage efficiencies of scale that we normally don't get to play with in order to address the most pressing issues of our time. I'm trying to remember what happens after this. I also just find it very interesting in pairing either waste systems or infrastructure systems that you normally wouldn't live next to with high density housing or just housing in general as a way of us needing to come to terms with what it might be to live next to or with any of the processes that help us exist. And then a teensy bit about the firm and work more specifically done at Studio MMR, which is our design firm based in LA that was started by me, Galileo Morandi, and Casey Ream. We are deeply committed to the intersection of contemporary technologies with art and design, and we leverage machine vision, data analysis, and interactive simulation to try and shape a more intelligent, responsive, and environmentally conscious future through the application of innovative design strategies. So this project in particular is one of a series. It's like a we've done quite a few variations on the Hoax Urbanism project that was started by Casey Ream and has been going on for I'm not sure how long, possibly 10 years. I've only been a part of it for the last couple of years. But we first used Zillow to mine real estate data. Actually, we did end up only using Zillow, but we also were using Redfin and Compass before this. But to mine real estate data for experimenting with artificial intelligence algorithms in an architectural context, and then using convolutional neural networks and related models to generate speculative cityscapes through processes of accretion, to simulate an infinitely tall city block, amplifying the banal through automation to produce a speculative context for architecture. We were generating real estate listings, the interior renders, language associated with the rental properties, speculations on the future cost. Spatial analysis, machine learning, simulations, and digital modeling techniques enable us to unravel the complexity of raw data, possibly from sensors, and then acting as a mediation layer. I haven't looked at this project in a while. It was kind of a fun one. So this project was commissioned by the Guinea Airport Authority in Conakry, Guinea, with the aim of investing in sustainable energy sources. The solar canopy consists of a standardized PV panels mounted on a concrete structure. The objective was to obviously provide shade for airport visitors as well as their cars, while simultaneously delivering cost-effective electricity to the site. This was also the first opportunity I had to go back to the energy modeling aspect of my life in the last couple of years, which was fun. I kind of missed it. Okay. And then as the final project that well, actually it's not. I forgot I added two more. I lied to you. So this one is called Neural Net City. It was an exhibition we did for the Seoul Biennale in 2021 that explored the transformation of the existing Seoul city plan based on extrapolating currently proposed or already implemented smart city technology. The specific focus of this transformation is how digital forms of governance and perception allow us to rethink traditional boundaries within cities. These boundaries could include between urban and wilderness, public and private, and the different program types within the city. I think I paused it on accident. As digital sensing and governing become more prevalent, what sorts of alternative thresholds could be established in place of these traditional city designs? The installation is composed of two main pieces, a 1 to 2000 mixed media master plan model and an interactive projective media piece that incorporated 3D sensing and 2D cameras to simulate a contemporary smart city technology. Yeah, essentially the second piece, which will come later in this video. This was more like the analysis and manipulation of the site. The second piece is an interactive exploration of the design opportunities afforded by ubiquitous sensing within the urban environment. Rather than focusing on dystopian tropes usually associated with the pluralistic panopticon embodied by the smart city, the piece leveraged surveillance space opportunistically as a new design space that we could use as architects. This piece also kind of helped me try to branch ideas of the urban scale master plan design and ideas of commodification, views of self, digital commerce, platform design, etc. If we ever get to it, we'll see. I'm afraid to skip ahead to the video because then it'll say, but I really want you to see the end of it. Because there's a lot of highly deformed faces in it, which are fun. Which might be a different theme of my work, but that's fine. Nope. Okay. I might show it later, we'll see. If I still had it on this computer, we could all just test it out instead, but that got moved to the archive a while ago. So. Was this the pandemic year? It was. Yes. So a different type of project working on it's like been a long-standing, there are a lot of different versions of these kind of generative chairs using different technologies, whether it's like more procedural or just generative. Whether it's more procedural or whether we're trying out a new technology, like these are the Gaussian splats type of models, and we were using NERFs before this as a way to just kind of, one, figure out how all of these models work, but two, figure out ways of designing and constraining within them. Or this is, we've done a series of, we call them decadent triptychs, so working with a pretty specific in-house process, but for generating large-scale diffusion images, so using the process of really zooming in and adding detail and increasing resolution, starting with something that's maybe 512 by 512 pixels, and by the end of it, seeing how far we could push this. And I wish I had the number for you, but we're definitely above 16,000 by 16,000. So that's it. Thanks. I think I should hit escape. Should I unplug it? Show something else? Okay. That was like the buckshot approach to everything, because I feel like it was like a little bit of everything, so sorry.
So of course, we always say about science and engineering that it's the hardest thing to communicate, like, to everyone else. So I see this as a great opportunity for that, and it certainly is entertaining. It makes me wonder how many of you there actually are, to cycle through that much. And you are in a unique position, I think, because you're straddling those two worlds of art and engineering. And that's a place where we see lots of breakthroughs throughout human history. And you're presenting to us that AI is one of the tools, the methods that a person on either end of that spectrum or that lies somewhere in between can use to not just explore or think about solving problems, but also present problems in other ways. Because, there's a lot of information in here that, to use a cow pun, is not readily digestible.
Yes.
Right?
10 out of 10. Thanks for that.
AI, however, is like a series of 5 stomachs, right? And it's a series of being able to interpolate and put things and make things together. And so what comes out then, it's better than burps, right? And the seaweed, does it imbue a umami kind of
It does.
flavor into the milk?
If you've ever had, like we eat
That
it.
was my question, by the way.
We actually do. Many of you might have consumed this without even knowing, because this particular red seaweed, and the name is escaping me right now, but I can look it up later, is a lot of what gets added to like traditional Hawaiian poke. If you've ever had that, there's like little flecks of like this purpley red seaweed, and that's the same seaweed. Because there's obviously definitely a conversation about ethics and feeding cows something that maybe they normally wouldn't. So the amount of testing that goes into that is, one of them was like, yeah, it's safe for us to eat also. We just generate less methane, I think.
It's also great to see that the intergenerational reach of the projects is good.
Some projects are too big for, I don't know. Yeah.
It seems to me that even though like there are instances where you said, for example, you're maybe even intentionally using a bad model, right? That you're trying to bring together such a diversity of different information elements right? But I think the sort of social commentary that your projects take on is always rather precise, right? In terms of like what you're trying to highlight and expose to the conversation. And I wonder, you know, if you have seen, at least with some of the artwork and installations, what the response of the audiences are in terms of like kind of what you're trying to highlight and how they decipher it, let's say.
Interesting. I again, like how people have responded to it is probably one of the. It's just another aspect in the study of the work, right? Like how people react to it or what they gain from it is like a part of the feedback loop into like the next iteration of whatever, because nothing exists by itself. Everything is a part of how we consume it or understand it. I think specifically with the machinic reflections piece, which I might rename the vanity, who knows. That one was very interesting. One, because it was the first project that I showed that was not for an audience of people who understood, one, anything about me, two, anything about machine learning. It was in a very traditional like art context, and the people that came, this was very new in terms of just an interactive piece, but also in terms of what it was trying to do. That's also kind of why in the piece I wanted to show the user the code as it was running through, because it was important for them to understand that they could at least have a window into that insight. I think what I understood from that is that the language of me explaining it was still very important, and that not for everyone, but for many people. And I think the first person that looked at it when he got lobbyist, and he was the one that was so unhappy. And he was like, I can't believe you're doing this. Like, I can't believe I got lobbyist. And I was like, yeah, well, okay. Like, I'm like, glad you're mad. Like, that's interesting. Like, let's unpack that. I think I lost sight of your question already, but I think that yeah, for me, I think looking at how other people experience it is very important. This also comes with students, because a lot of the students that I work with have, again, like backgrounds in, I almost want to say like capital A architecture. And so then by forcing them, and me and everyone else, in order to think about this at a completely different scale, through a lens of which I think often people say is like, no, that's for the engineer to figure out. Like, no, that's for someone else. And I'm kind of like, no, like we can also kind of take control of these things as well. We don't need to shed that liability. Like, that's something that I think architects could do. That's a very interesting conversation as well.
Hilarious, I can see. Yeah, thanks a lot, Laure. I'm curious. I mean, like the huge kind of tirade of projects that you showed are each kind of beautiful in their own way. I'm curious about ideas of beauty and kind of love and humor and joy in the projects, because they all kind of fall into this. And I mean, you kind of showed us your intertwined background as well. I'm wondering towards the side of aesthetics and the kind of idea of beauty in the projects, because they always have this science fiction kind of pseudo-scientific data visualization aesthetic. And then I'm wondering, is it essential for the projects to look like that for you? How do you kind of see that? For example, this chair that you showed us, you know, what would be a register of talking about it beyond the kind of technique of production? Yeah.
That is a very good question, and one that I am definitely still grappling with, because yes, there is definitely that overarching aesthetic theme of most of my work. I was actually talking to a friend and colleague the other day, and we were talking about branding, which I think this is a part of that conversation, and trying to figure out, when you're working with these diffusion models, when you're talking about prompt engineering, when we're talking about intellectual property, how to make something yours and like your style. And what does that even mean? How do you find that? And he was talking about it in terms of his work and how he needs to figure out a new language for this series he's working on. And for me, I was like, I don't have one. I need to figure out what my language even is. Like, what am I interested in? Like, what is beauty? And he was like, are you serious? It's very obvious to me when I see your work that there's like a line running through this and that it's very obviously yours. And like, I didn't show a lot of the fashion images, but the fashion one is like technical fashion. Like, yeah, for sure. So I think I'm happy that there's like an aesthetic theme over all of it. Do I think that it's important? I think right now it is important for me in that maybe it's tied to the branding aspect of it. Maybe it's still important to have that window into the back end of how things are working, because as an example, again, tied to the machinic reflections piece, another thing I had that went along with that was I had actually printed out the data set and put it in a binder on the table next to it. So people could flip through and kind of look at the different categories and the faces associated with it. And that was a very vulnerable moment for me. I was like, but this is the project. Like, this is the intelligence. Like, you don't understand. Like, that, sure, this is how you might interface with it, but like, this is terrifying to let someone look through and get access to. So yeah, I think that for me, it's just important to have that window into that back end of it. I also am happy that you read the sense of humor that comes through that, because if you can't tell, I have a lot of fun in doing all of this. Because, of course, I wouldn't be doing it if I didn't, but I'm glad that comes through.
It's clear that the joy is incredibly clear. But then that's what I'm kind of troubled by, how. So you have this kind of scientific projects with the students, and then they somehow, even with the students, they fall into a genre of imagery that goes directly with kind of fake news and propaganda images around climate change and this and that. How to kind of grapple with that? Is it because then if that's a stance against kind of the destructive practices of the planet, then it falls into the same genres that they perpetuate their propaganda, and not that you have to invent a new genre of imagery to fight that, but how could we possibly play with that? And I have no answers, huh? So I'm just
No,
asking.
it's a very interesting point, and I definitely need to think about that a little bit more. But I would say that I am very interested in the language of propaganda as a way of talking about anything, and it doesn't matter which side. I think that propaganda is fascinating and very human. That's interesting.
Okay. I loved your presentation. I love that there's an artistic flow and joy through it. It makes me want to learn more about the work behind it. It stimulates my curiosity. And you mentioned a couple of times that you had this project and the anxiety that you have about having all these different classifications. And I'm wondering if you find that that's maybe what makes your work really exciting, is the interplay between the different disciplines and being able to maybe step back and in and out of different ones, and maybe that makes your message more accessible. I don't know.
I think it definitely affords me a flexibility that maybe others don't feel that they could embrace. And I really enjoy that, and I take that freedom very seriously. So yes, I think that makes sense. But I also think that it does add some complexity in terms of interfacing with the rest of society in certain ways, or which isn't a bad thing. But yes, thanks.
Sorry, me again. I really, really enjoyed your talk, and as others have mentioned, I really appreciated the way that you talked about the pedagogical aspect of that. I also work with a lot of students who have never in any way, shape, or form experienced the process of coding or designing, and so I appreciate that. But the question I have actually relates to Adil's question about propaganda. and also working within these capitalist systems. So kind of to continue from my question from last time, from a philosophical perspective, I would argue that a lot of these systems of discretization or compression are actually incentivized by capitalism, right? And I love your work where you're trying to actually repair a lot of the harms that have come from those systems. So I love the example about the cows, right? Where you're saying, okay, based upon these models where we're taking this discretized data and we're saying, okay, if you feed them, you know, this much was half of a pound of seaweed a day, you can have this massive positive effect. And yet they're looking at the analog qualia of taste of the meat, that experiential aspect, and then meat companies and producers are coming in and discretizing that into a capitalist system that they can use to maximize profits. And so I guess what I'm asking is how do we engage with these tools in reparative ways and supersede these capitalistic, you know, lids that they're placing on our attempts to subvert or supersede them?
Yeah. Well, I think that education plays a part in terms of never taking anything at face value and needing to understand where everything, well, trying to figure out where everything comes from. And, you know, but with any of these systems, with literally any of these projects, everything is so much more complicated than I could even understand or hope to. I think a project that I just started researching was talking, which I think kind of exemplifies this idea exactly, and maybe explains how I'm also just not sure and still trying to think through a lot of these things. But so there's a lithium deposit in the U.S. and there's the will to build a lithium mine on top of that. The issue being that there's a specific type of flower that grows there and only there, and it's protected as an endangered flower. And so you know, you're playing with these ideas of like, oh, well, we're trying to electrify the grid. We're trying to get EVs everywhere, you know, in order to reduce carbon emissions, but at what cost? Like, what do you disrupt within, especially like when it comes to mining and heavy mineral, like the needing to think through the history of everything gets more complicated. Like, sure, you drive, you know, a Tesla, but where does that all come from? And the life cycle cost analysis of things, which is something you can do, and I'm sure you can then make those decisions, but now you've spent 3 years researching this and you don't have a car because you don't know what to buy or whatever. But okay, so when it comes to the lithium mine and the flower, what really interested me in this story was that the owners and operators of the potential mine, I think they're based out of Australia, but I'm not sure, have funded the single biggest biolab in order to try and figure out how to grow and increase the population of that flower so that it's no longer on the endangered species list. And to me, that is fascinating because now you have someone who's on the mining side of, and if you're just thinking about the world in terms of like black and white, good and evil, you're like, oh no, like mining bad. But, you know, spending insane amounts of money that normally would not be given to any university in order to study, in order to do something in terms of like saving this population of a flower. And like how complex that is. But also it's like, this entire conversation is so, even though we're talking about the flower, it's still so human-centered, and that like what we're caring about is really like we still get access to the lithium in order to do this. And so a part of even sending the scale out way so much further is like maybe trying to not center us in many ways and like thinking about it from a different target. You know, I don't know. I find that interesting. I'm not even sure that answered anything, but it is what I'm thinking about.
I just love to
Yeah.
perspectives on it.
Just very short question. If you imagine that your work was textual, that it was text-based, what kind of genre would you put yourself in?
Oh no, I have to categorize myself. It's my worst
No,
fear.
I'm sorry if it's offending.
No, I'm just laughing. Okay, so I'm in, you know, questions I was also asking about the ideas of language on the last project, because I find it so interesting that so much of the work we're doing in AI right now is language-based, but it also makes so much sense because how else do you explain anything? How else do you get any sort of anything? Like, the importance of the feedback loop from my projects is when having to talk about it through someone else. And language is so complicated and so nuanced. It changes so much depending on where you are or what area you're in. I'm trying to dance around this a lot because I have no idea. And I think I would need to find out what your genres are, and I would choose from one of them.
I also think that there's a very humanistic aspect to the work, right, where there's a very sort of serious side. We're looking at climate change and emissions. There's also this very human side that's about, and I think this comes from the pedagogy of the students, that they have a sort of naivete, right, that exists and says, I want to map Christmas spirit, right? I think that's the thing that's like, so, because I think like if we only focus on this, then we lose sight of the joys and like the taste of meat, right, which is important, right, and that kind of all filters in. And I think somehow there's this sort of connection or feedback loop between all these projects that you're starting to kind of construct, I think, which is really interesting.
I think so too. Yeah, that was a fun one. She was also the youngest one in the group at 13. So I was like, this is wild. I don't know, that was an interesting experience. But yeah.
I could offer science journalism in a way. There's a whole series of books that are out there that take really difficult topics to deal with and they put them into language that we all read, and usually it's interwoven with stories and anecdotes, pieces of history, projections into the future, bits of pleasure and tales of pain, but it's always about conveying the science behind it, right? The latest research. So maybe that's your genre.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I had joked earlier that one of the reasons I went into engineering is because I didn't like writing. I mean, I wasn't very good at English, so I'm gonna hold on to that one. So, yeah.
I'm actually looking at your work also through the lens of the previous presentation, and I was thinking especially, and by the way, parenthesis, I was thinking also of the powers of 10 as a pedagogical tool. Students always find it fascinating, and there's a little bit of that happening here as well. But what I wanted to say was slightly different. I was thinking about the proxy phases that the students did. And there's a lot of connections here to the Victorian era, as well as contemporary art, like I'm thinking of Rebecca Forn, who maybe was a reference there. So if we use your corpus, is there a way that we can look at these artifacts more as historically, culturally formed, rather than, I'm not actually quite certain, maybe you talk a little bit about how they came about, but maybe they come about as a way to understand the Victorian era, for example, or a different period.
I find that very interesting. I would definitely love to extend this project. We did a little bit, this is a 10-week project with the students who had never used any sort of machine learning before. So we got to dive a little bit into the history of some masks. We obviously talked about Victorian masks. We also were talking a lot about, the dancers in China that changed their mask without using their hands, and like the importance of switching characters within that, as well as a range of others, including like the Japanese demon masks, or like the purpose of a mask even, whether it's to hide or to show something else, to scare something, have you. I'm obsessed with the data set and the ability to go through it. So if you want to collaborate on something and like you let me know, I will get you that data set that you need, and that's fine. Yeah, I don't really have anything else besides, yes, I find that super interesting, and I think that that's definitely something to be explored a little bit more. I think a lot of the masks that we were working with and the students were designing, and one interesting conversation that came out of that was the importance of needing to possibly still look like a human to us, but not to the model, or to not look like a human to us, but to the model, and like making sure that that was different, that you didn't just read as a bird and look like a bird. Which then made you kind of refocus on ideas of like, fashion, makeup, all of that, and how we represent ourselves in daily life outside of thinking about machine learning, but just through adornment. But yeah. Okay, cool.